I'll start off slowly. There's still 20 to come on, I reckon, so I won't get started for a minute or so. Just let me say how all this began. I remember in my teens in the Boy Scouts, I went to a gathering, a jamboree, and it was addressed by Baron MacLeod of Funerey. You may remember George MacLeod, a most unconventional Church of Scotland minister. But as I shook his hand, he said, "Bruce, do you realise you're shaking hands with a man who has shaken hands with a man who shook hands with Bonnie Prince Charlie?" And it kind of made me realise that what I thought as a young teenager was ancient history was only 3 handshakes away. And that got me hooked. It got my interest in history. And my passion now is to try and research local stories and put them into a bigger context. And you can't get much bigger a context than the Jacobite rebellion. So now at 7:02, let me take you there and we'll have a look at Linlithgow and the Jacobite rebellion. If you're all sitting comfortably, the good thing, of course, about home lectures, you can be sitting in your slippers. I've actually got pajama bottoms on under this jacket and black sheep top. You can also have a little drink. I've only got water, but feel free to imbibe as we go through the evening on the Jacobites and Linlithgow. This you'll recognise as the tomb in St Michael's Kirkyard of the Livingsons, Earls of Linlithgow. It was originally contained within its own aisle, you can see on the right there, constructed of King's Cable sandstone. But by the mid-19th century, the burial annex was regarded as an eyesore and it was removed. It was remarked at that time that the presence of the unsightly mausoleum was an embarrassment to the town, given that the Livingston family had been declared traitors on account of their support for the Jacobite cause. In 1980, the tomb was broken into and the lead caskets of the occupants ripped open. The skull on the left is that of George Livingston, keeper of Linlithgow Palace, colonel of the Scots Regiment of Foot Guards, and a staunch supporter of the Stuart monarchy. And yes, that is me, top right, in an earlier incarnation. In 1684, George Livingston was appointed Justice General of Scotland, but lost the position 5 years later after the Glorious Revolution, when King William and Queen Mary came over from the Netherlands and took the throne from the exiled King James VII and II. George Livingston could not tolerate this, declaring it to be an act against God and the divine right of the Stuarts. And so he became active in a plot led by Sir James Montgomery to bring the exiled monarch back to Britain. And this marks the very start of the movement known as Jacobitism. Jacobus, of course, being the Latin name for James. George Livingston died in 1690 before his involvement was discovered. There are so many myths concerning this period of Scottish history. So let's tonight examine the true course of the Jacobite uprisings and on the way discover any Linlithgow connections. Buried next to his father in the Livingston crypt is the 3rd Earl's son, also called George, an equally staunch Jacobite, who too opposed the arrival of King Billy, even if his wife Mary was a Stuart. The 4th Earl had inherited the position of keeper of Linlithgow Palace and sincerely felt the need to support the cause of the royal family, which had strong connections to Linlithgow. The first Stuart monarch, Robert II, had granted the borough its royal charter. All the Stuart monarchs from James I to Charles I had stayed in the town's royal residence. 2 had actually been born there, James V and Mary Stuart. So as a loyal Stuart supporter, Livingston got involved in the 1689 attempt to oppose King William, and with a contingent of dragoons from Linlithgow and the surrounding area, rode to join John Graham, Viscount Dundee, who had raised the Stuart standard and set up his headquarters at Blair Castle. Although the Scottish Episcopal Church did not officially endorse the Jacobite cause, Many Episcopalians, believing in the God-given power of kings and bishops, flocked to Bonnie Dundee's colours. The response of the government was to send an army under General Hugh Mackay of Skourie. And on the morning of 27th July 1689, Mackay's force of 3,000 infantrymen and 1,000 cavalry made their way along the rough track through the pass of Killiecrankie. Dundee formed his troops along the higher slopes, with Livingston and his gentlemen of horse near the centre. The government troops took up positions lower down the slope with their back to the River Garry, and for 2 hours the opposing armies just looked at each other. Mackay's cannons then opened up, but proved ineffective as they were trying to fire up the side of the glen. At about 7 p.m, the sun sank over the hills to the west, and with the light no longer in their eyes, Dundee gave the order to his men to charge. Around 800 Jacobites were killed by gunfire during that assault, but the rest penetrated enemy lines. When they closed in, Dundee's men each fired a single shot with their musket before discarding it in favour of their broadsword and targe. They engaged the government troops, many of whom were still struggling to fix bayonets. Most of the Jacobite fighters knew the area well and were adept at fighting on steep and rocky terrain, and the result was carnage. Many of Mackay's inexperienced troops tried to flee, only to find their retreat cut off by the river. Mackay and some others managed to ford the river a little way upstream before retreating west, but 2,000 were not so lucky and died during the battle or the pursuit led by Livingston and his horsemen. One who could count himself exceptionally lucky was a redcoat called Donald McBain, who fled back into the pass with the enemy in close pursuit and escaped by jumping the river between 2 rocks. This 18-foot gap is still called, of course, the Soldier's Leap. And so the Jacobites won the day. For among the dead was their leader, Bonnie Dundee, mortally wounded by a musket ball. Tradition relates that he was sitting against this standing stone when he died. He was buried in the vault beneath St. Bride's Kirk in the grounds of Blair Castle. And without Dundee in charge, the 1689 Jacobite rebellion failed. Killiecrankie is said to be the most haunted battlefield in Britain. Each year on the anniversary of the battle, the vegetation through the pass turns blood red. Perhaps a freak of the sun, perhaps not. In addition, many claim to have witnessed ghostly figures, severed body parts, or time warps depicting some of the brutal action of the battle. I don't know, but what has definitely turned up on the battlefield very recently was evidence of the first ever hand grenade to be used in conflict. It was discovered along with many pistol and musket balls using metal detectors in the River Garry. Following the battle, the Earl of Linlithgow, his 2 sons, and his son-in-law were all arrested and accused of being rebels. They were imprisoned in Edinburgh Castle, only being released some months later after taking an oath of allegiance to King William. General Mackay spent the winter reducing Jacobite strongholds in the Highlands and constructing a base at Fort William, from where the government troops successfully took a Jacobite force by surprise at Cromdale in May 1690. 400 Highlanders were killed, many others only escaped when a thick fog enveloped the area. Fiona Hislop did not fight at the Battle of Cromdale. She's there because she declared the area a protected site in 2011. She was then, of course, Scottish Culture Secretary. Credit for the success at Cromdale went to another Livingston, Sir Thomas, but he was no Jacobite. In fact, he was government army commander, spending 2 years attacking Jacobite strongholds and becoming involved in the aftermath of the massacre of Glencoe, where Clan MacDonald was punished for not quickly enough swearing an oath of allegiance to King William. This letter from Thomas Livingston refers, of course, to the part played by the Campbells in the slaughter, an incident which increased opposition to King William in the Highlands. Thomas Livingston played one other part in the Jacobite story. A group of James VII's supporters had taken possession of the government prison on the island of North Berwick called the Bass Rock. Imprisoned there, 4 Jacobite officers had taken advantage of the prison garrison when they were busy unloading a supply ship, and they seized the fort's cannons. Livingston was ordered to arrest the escaped prisoners, but he could not get near the island. They had the cannons. So for 3 years, the Jacobites carried out daring raids on the mainland and on passing ships, gradually being joined by other Jacobite fugitives. Their leader, a man with Broxburn connections, Captain Michael Middleton, was regularly encouraged in letters from King James himself. In the end, it took diplomacy and Jacobite cunning. Middleton invited a government official to the island where dummy guards had been planted around the rock to make it look like there were more than the 16 who were actually holed up there. A table was laid out for a sumptuous banquet to show that they could still hold out for months. In fact, the Jacobite leader was using all the food they had available. The ruse succeeded, and on the 18th of April 1694, the Jacobite defenders accepted the very attractive surrender terms, free transport to France and the release from prison of all those caught helping them. And so for a while, Jacobite activity decreased and the movement went underground. Fresh hope was engendered by the little gentleman in the velvet jacket, as the Jacobite toast went, paying tribute to the mole whose burrow caused King William's horse to stumble, breaking the monarch's collarbone. An infection set in. William then contracted pneumonia and died on March the 8th, 1702. The illustration in the top left comes from the great tapestry of Scotland, now permanently displayed in Galashiels. William's sister-in-law became Queen Anne, but as her 12-year reign played out, speculation arose over who would succeed her, as baby after baby was either miscarried or stillborn. Jacobite hopes rose that a Stuart monarch might still return to the throne. Further problems affected Scotland after Anne signed the Act of Union, ending the centuries-old Scottish Parliament and granting the Scots 45 seats in the new British House of Commons, one more than the single county of Cornwall. 2 of Linlithgow's representatives in the last Scottish Parliament voted for union, the Earl of Hopetoun and John Montgomery of Ray, who had just sold 35 acres of land at Magdalenes to St Michael's Church, the origin of the session lands of that kirk. In common with most Scottish towns, the Linlithgow Borough Council vehemently opposed the idea of the parliamentary union. But the Act was signed on May the 1st, 1707, and at the Linlithgow marches shortly afterwards, feelings were running high. It was reported that the riding took place, and I quote the town council record, in solemn fashion with tension and uncertainty in the air. Eventually a riot broke out and the day had to be cut short. Taking advantage of Scottish unrest, the French planned an invasion, ostensibly to help a Jacobite uprising to restore James Francis Edward Stuart to the throne. It would also distract the British government from fighting in the War of Spanish Succession, in which France was engaged. So with James II's 19-year-old son, also James, on board the ship, the plan was to land some 5,000 French soldiers in northeast Scotland, where they would fight alongside a Jacobite army. In expectation of this success, this medal on the left was struck. French commander Claude de Forbin was never happy with the plan, and his fears were proved correct. The date set for the expedition had to be put back when young James caught measles. A further delay was caused by severe storms, during which the young prince was violently seasick. Eventually, the French fleet entered the Firth of Forth in March 1708 and looked for a safe anchorage. A British fleet under the command of Admiral Byng was spotted, and the French vessels hurriedly sailed north, round the top of Scotland and back to Dunkirk. For the French, it was a success, as the incident tied up a high proportion of the British Navy and led to troops being withdrawn from Europe. But for the Jacobites, a dismal failure. Those who had shown any interest in the project were arrested, and these included Lord Ross of Hawkhead, whose principal residence was Hawkhead Castle near Paisley, but he also had a Linlithgow mansion on the south side of the High Street. His ducat, which supplied him with fresh pigeon meat, is still in situ, close to the canal basin. Lord Ross was taken to London through Traitor's Gate and imprisoned in the Tower, only being released after many months when no substantial evidence could be found to incriminate him. And meanwhile, Jacobite supporters were keeping their heads down, and this included James Livingstone, the 5th Earl of Linlithgow. He successfully kept his Jacobite leanings secret, and in 1712 was appointed captain of the company of foot stationed in Blackness Castle. He also resided in his family seat in Callendar House and in Midhope Castle, where some evidence points towards him conducting secret meetings there, plotting to bring James Stuart, the old pretender, over from France to lead a revolution. Midhope, of course, as any Outlander fans out there will know, is the castle of Lallybroch, hero of the Jacobite Jamie Fraser, played by Scottish actor Sam Heughan in the TV series created by Diane Gabaldon. Back in 1714, Linlithgow burghers were preparing for the death of the childless Queen Anne and the thorny question of who would be the next monarch. Linlithgow Provost Alexander Glenn of Longcroft received an intimation from the Privy Council instructing him that he should, in the event of Her Majesty's death, do his utmost to ensure the public peace. Glenn took the warning seriously and proposed that the borough should be made ready to provide an armed guard. To further protect the community, he and his magistrates went through the borough, inspecting the town wall and the weapons possessed by the burgesses. The report was not favourable, and Glenn was commissioned to go to Edinburgh to procure more muskets. Queen Anne died on August the 1st, 1714, and when the Westminster Parliament immediately declared the Protestant ruler of Hanover as King George I, Linlithgow prepared for a possible rebellion. It was well known that the 5th Earl was a Jacobite supporter and that other Linlithgow residents in positions of power were fellow sympathisers. Hedging their bets, the town council congratulated the new monarch and, as the borough record states, illuminated the cross with fireworks and a large celebratory bonfire. However, the atmosphere was still tense. The next morning, the town awoke to find that posters had been fixed to the crosswell, to the gates of the Wateryet, and on the house doors of Provost Glenn and the Baileys. The tract criticised the newly appointed king, declaring that he was not divinely appointed, that he knew nothing of his new kingdom, that he couldn't even speak English. He was not fit to rule. The verse on the poster read, "No more shall foreign scum pollute our throne. No longer under such we'll blush and groan, but Scottish men a Scottish king will own." George, of course, was eligible to be chosen as king, as his mother, Sophia of Hanover, was a daughter of Princess Elizabeth, who was daughter of King James VI. She had been brought up in Linlithgow Palace by the 1st Earl of Linlithgow. But even with that connection, many were still against the choice of the Protestant monarch. Alarmed by the possibility of a revolution, the Linlithgow Town Council hastily met and informed James Graham, Duke of Montrose, keeper of the Great Seal of Scotland, and look who's holding that here. The Duke thanked the provost and the bailies and congratulated them on diligently taking action to prevent an insurrection. However, the threatened rebellion did materialise when John Erskine, Earl of Mar, raised the standard in support of James VIII and III. The 5th Earl of Linlithgow showed his true colours and immediately left the palace to join the rebels, being rewarded by receiving the honour of carrying the Royal Stuart standard. An early success in capturing Perth saw an upsurge in Jacobite support, and it split the Linlithgow Town Council into Whigs in support of the Hanoverian monarchy and the Jacobites. A council meeting was hastily arranged in the borough halls to discuss, as it says in the council record, the imminent danger that the present happy constitution is exposed to. While sympathetic to the Stuart cause, Provost Glen hedged his bets and agreed to send a deputation to the Earl of Hopetoun, Lord Lieutenant of the county, to demand 400 stand of arms and suitable ammunition. Provost Glen decided to keep a low profile. He was not present at the next council meeting, and he was not at home when a deputation went to fetch him. The provost-less meeting appointed Clerk Alexander Bell to contact the Earl of Hopetoun and inform him that there were 400 loyal Linlithgow citizens willing to fight for King George, but sadly they only had 200 weapons available. And would the Duke of Argyll, Commander-in-Chief of the government forces, supply them with more? And weapons were needed, as the insurrection led to the Battle of Sheriffmuir, fought near Dunblane. The 5th Earl commanded a squadron of horse, but took little part in the action. Camped out on a bleak moor, the government army, led by the Duke of Argyll, faced some 10,000 Jacobites, 70% of whom were Episcopalians, under the poor leadership of Mar, and little happened. Some skirmishes took place with the loss of 400 Jacobites and 250 Hanoverian troops. But the conflict ultimately ended in stalemate, as the contemporary song went, "There's some say that we wan, and some say that they wan, and some say that nane wan at all, man." The Jacobites had lost what many think was their best chance of success, given the mood in Scotland at that time. One of the government casualties was a young officer we'll meet again, Colonel Henry Hawley, who was shot through the body but gradually recovered. James Livingstone was accused of high treason, duly convicted and attainted. That is, all his titles and all his properties were forfeited to the crown. These included Callendar House, Midhope Castle, and the keepership of Linlithgow Palace, which passed to James, 5th Duke of Hamilton. Livingstone managed to flee to the continent and joined the would-be King James III in exile in Italy. The 5th Earl of Linlithgow died in Rome and was probably buried in the church of Sant'Andrea degli Scozzesi, which has now been deconsecrated and turned into the headquarters of a large law firm. Other rebels were not so lucky. So many were arrested that King George had to issue the command on the left that only a selection of prisoners were to be tried, the names drawn by lot. As the arrow points to, none were to be, quote, gentlemen or men of estates. 120 were eventually hanged, and the likes of the Dukes of Athol and Gordon, and the Earls of Aberdeen, Breadalbane, Errol and Nithsdale were fined the equivalent today of £525,000. Meanwhile, back in Linlithgow, Provost John Smith was having to deal with the continuing presence of 300 Redcoat Dragoons, sent in readiness for a Jacobite assault on either Stirling or Edinburgh. The rebellion over, Linlithgow was still hosting the government army. As in April 1716, the town council record shows that Provost Smith had to entertain the army commander, the Duke of Argyll, all his officers, and spent a fortune at a banquet in the palace, which, I quote from the record, lasted till the moon came up. Sounds like a good night. The cost of provisioning the resident troops was prohibitive, and both John Smith and his successor, Thomas Ranald, struggled to make ends meet. In order to defray the expense, the council imposed a tax of 2d on each pint of ale drunk in the town's pubs. It took many years for the Scots to see any benefits of the union with England and the consequent use of their colonial trade. Agriculture also took ages to improve, and the Linlithgow population still occasionally went hungry as a result of poor harvests, accruing from the old-fashioned run-rig farming. In 1719 then, the Jacobites tried again, this time backed by Spain, then engaged in the War of Quadruple Alliance with Britain. A plan was hatched to send a fleet of 20 ships with 7,000 Spanish soldiers to meet a large Highland army at the head of Loch Duich and march together to capture Inverness and then head south. Severe storms saw many of the Spanish ships unable to sail, so in fact 2 Spanish frigates with 300 Marines landed at Loch Alsh, and along with about 1,000 Highlanders marched to Eilean Donan Castle, which they garrisoned before moving on towards Inverness. The castle was quickly recaptured by a British naval squadron. And meanwhile, the Jacobite and the Spanish foot soldiers made camp in Glen Shiel. Unfortunately, the defences were no match for a new government weapon, the Cohorn mortar, which bombarded the rebels before the government army successfully advanced. The piece of mortar shell shown here was found during archaeological work on the 300th anniversary of the battle, June the 10th, 2019. In June 1719, mortar shells and grenades set the heather on fire, and the smoke screen allowed many Scots to escape. The Spanish soldiers all surrendered, and as regular troops, not rebels, they were allowed to return home. Meanwhile, Linlithgow was trying to sort out the difficult situation left by the failed rebellions. Taxation had to be increased to pay for repairs. The town jail in the borough halls was full of suspects. Provost Ronald wrote to the authorities in Edinburgh, pleading with them to remove the still billeted soldiers, who he described as milling about the streets, cursing and blaspheming. He received little satisfaction and soon gave up the provostship. The new provost, Sir Walter Sandylance Hamilton, was a career soldier. He had served under the Duke of Marlborough at the battles of Ramillies and Blenheim. He lived here in Westport House and loved nothing better than to relive his military life, forming up chairs in the drawing room in line of battle, and with the help of his daughter and an elderly aunt, recreating his famous conflicts. And he behaved in town like a military governor, and soon had things licked into shape, insisting, for example, that every inhabitant attend the riding of the marches as part of their civic duty, and to increase comradeship and mutual respect. He supervised the forfeited estate of Callander, holding it in trust for the 5th Earl's daughter, Lady Anne Livingston, and we'll meet her again. Sir Walter died in his 80s in 1762 and is commemorated on the tombstone you see on the right in St. Michael's Church. Slowly, the town's fortunes increased. Much of the Jacobite fervour died down. The borough concentrated on its main sources of industry, leather making, brewing, and linen, as witnessed by Daniel Defoe on his visit in 1727, when he commented, "There is a very great linen manufacture, and the water of the loch is esteemed with the best in Scotland for bleaching linen cloth." Provost John Buckney was able to declare in 1740 that the borough finances were so healthy that it was possible to hand out several payments to the needy poor of the parish, and to make a healthy donation to the recently opened Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh. Scotland continued to experience a revival in its fortunes. Harvests were good. Some trading benefits of the Act of Union began to be felt. But once again, rebellion impacted on Linlithgow, on the nation and its economic position. With the arrival in Scotland of Charles, Edward, Louis, John, Casimir, Sylvester, Severino, Maria Stuart, that's Bonnie Prince Charlie to you, and with the raising of the Jacobite standard at Glenfinnan on August the 19th, 1745, the challenge began to the Hanoverian succession. Incidentally, these cigarette cards you see here were issued by Mitchell's Tobacco Company, whose life began in Linlithgow. Also on August the 19th, the government commander-in-chief, Sir John Cope, and his royal forces passed through Linlithgow, heading for Stirling, where another squadron of anti-Jacobite troops had gathered. A further body of government soldiers, under the command of Colonel James Gardner, arrived in the borough, and Gardner knew Linlithgow well, for he was born in Carridon and educated at Linlithgow Grammar School. As usual, the men quartered themselves in the houses of the inhabitants and awaited the arrival of a Jacobite army, which was reported to be approaching. Local fears were of a possible conflict, like the Battle of Linlithgow Bridge, which had been fought 200 years before. However, on this occasion, no armed encounter took place. Colonel Gardner was not in the best of health and decided to retreat to Corstorphine. Linlithgow consequently lay abandoned, and the Jacobite troops fell upon the town, helping themselves to anything that took their fancy. Provost Buckney experienced mixed emotions as he harboured Jacobite sympathies. Indeed, on June the 10th, 1745, in the palace, he had celebrated the birthday of, as he himself stated, the rightful King James III. He did this in the company of the keeper, Mrs. Glen Gordon. Buckney may have toasted the king over the water and kept a collection of Jacobite-related items like those shown here, but he also had the well-being of the community at heart and had not demurred when the town council sent a loyal address to King George II. When rebellion did come, Buckney decided that discretion was the better part of valour and fled the town. He probably judged that the Jacobite chances of success were limited, and he would also have been aware of what had happened in the last rebellion to those who had joined the Jacobite side. And he was not alone in making himself scarce, as his flight to Edinburgh was copied by most of the menfolk of the borough, leaving the town's women to welcome the young Chevalier. And his arrival caught many by surprise. That day, September 15th, 1745, being a Sunday morning, many of the ladies of the town, including Lady Provost Buckney and her daughters, were on their way up the Kirkgate to attend church, when Charlie and his retinue suddenly appeared at the cross. While the prince rode up towards the palace, his army moved off to camp at the hamlet of Magdalens, now where Maidlands is. Hastily donning tartan and white cockades, the townswomen queued up to kiss the prince's hand. In the palace, where the 25-year-old young pretender was obviously intent on walking in the footsteps of his ancestors, declaring himself to be the true Stuart heir, the son of his father, the rightful king. The prince was enthusiastically welcomed by Mrs. Glen Gordon, whom a contemporary observer records as the housekeeper, not the keeper of the palace. And that would fit in with my research, which revealed that the lady was not an aristocrat, but in fact an Edinburgh girl, born in the Lucken Booths beside St. Giles, and called Miss Glen. She married a Mr. Gordon of Ellen and was thereafter known as Mrs. Glen Gordon, probably securing her position in the palace through a connection to the still powerful Livingston family. Mrs. Glen Gordon is said in an account written in the Caledonian Mercury, quote, to have in an excess of regal zeal set the palace fountain running copiously with wine. Did the prince study the fountain, I wonder, and muse on the fact that his 3 times great granny Mary Stuart had been born there, and later was branded as a scheming seductress, portrayed as a mermaid, like the one carved on that fountain? After considerable refreshments had been partaken, and the prince had suitably charmed all the Linlithgow women, Charles moved off, spending the night in King's Cavil House, his troops camping nearby on fields at 3 Mile Town. When the prince left Linlithgow, however, very few locals joined his colours. One who did was William Boyd, the 4th Earl of Kilmarnock, who had married Anne, you remember, the daughter of the 5th Earl of Linlithgow. She had exhorted him to follow the young pretender, and he was to regret that, as did others from Linlithgow, recorded in the document the prisoners of the 45. Among them was James Harvey, a Linlithgow Bridge innkeeper, whose hostelry had long been a meeting place for Jacobite adherents. Harvey went on to become quartermaster in Lord Kilmarnock's Foot Guards before being captured and hanged at Penrith. Other locals taken prisoner included James Smith, a Linlithgow lawyer, arrested while wearing the uniform of Lord Elcho's Lifeguards, red and blue tunic, scarlet and gold waistcoat, a gold-laced hat with a white cockade. The man certainly stood out. He was quickly arrested and imprisoned in Edinburgh Castle. Another was Margaret Dykes, who followed the prince into England and was later punished by being taken to Antigua on board the transportation ship, the Veteran. It left Liverpool on May the 8th, 1747. Once at their destination, the prisoners, which included a 12-year-old boy, were due to be sold into slavery on a sugar plantation. But during the voyage, the ship was captured by the French, and the 150 prisoners on board taken to the French island colony of Martinique, where the governor promptly released them. What happened to the good-looking Margaret Dykes is unknown. Are there little Dykes scurrying all over Martinique to this day? Some of those arrested did get released. 3 Linlithgow publicans, Andrew Turner, Walter Miller, and Archibald McSween, were tried for, quote, assisting rebel regiments. All 3 were discharged, and it seems likely that all they were guilty of was serving refreshments to the Highland horde, and it certainly would have been very difficult for them to refuse to serve a Highland soldier alcohol. Also questioned was the then Minister of St. Michael's, the Reverend Robert Dalgleish. They were asking him about the existence in the town of an illegal Episcopalian meeting house, wherein it had been reported a wedding had taken place, officiated by a non-juring priest, one who had not sworn an oath of loyalty to King George. The wedding was attended, it was further alleged, by Miss Clementina Walkinshaw, who had travelled from her uncle's house in Bannockburn, and she was later to be a mistress of Bonnie Prince Charlie when he was exiled in France. Meanwhile, the Jacobite army marched on to Edinburgh, and they entered on September 17th. The capital was ready for them, as a messenger from Linlithgow had galloped there and issued a warning, but there was no resistance. And in fact, some 20,000 people lined the streets of the capital to get a glimpse of the prince as he rode to the palace of Holyrood. What followed is largely out with the main remit of my presentation. Briefly though, a Jacobite victory over General John Cope's army at Prestonpans, which saw the death of Caradon-born Colonel Gardiner, commemorated on a plaque on the wall of the ruined Caradon Kirk. For the TV episode of Outlander, the battle, fought on September 21st, 1745, was reenacted in the Muravenside Country Park. Then after that came the invasion of England, the capture of Carlisle, and the march south. On December 4th, the Jacobite invaders entered Derby and paused. English Jacobites had not risen in large numbers, and the hope of French assistance was dashed. The sad retreat began. The next time the rebellion affected Linlithgow was in January 1746, when the Jacobite leader, Lord George Murray, and a band of Highlanders descended on the town in search of provisions. On the approach of a government army, the Jacobite troops quickly left, the two armies getting so close that it was said that the rear of one group chatted to the vanguard of the other as they passed over the River Avon. At the head of a pursuing army, General Hawley arrived in the borough and spent the night of January 15th, 1746, in the palace. The next day, the army marched westward and lined up in battle formation on Falkirk Muir. The Jacobite army was not yet in a position to fight, and so, to give them time, Lady Anne Kilmarnock, you remember, the Jacobite daughter of the 5th Earl of Linlithgow, persuaded Hawley to spend the night in Callendar House. As one report put it, and I quote, "She entertained him with such affability that under the blandishments of her ladyship, he remained longer than was consistent with his duty, staying overnight and taking breakfast in the stately home the next morning." What blandishments Anne Livingstone lavished on the general, I'll leave to your imagination. But when battle came, Hawley was certainly not ready, and neither was his army, which was roundly defeated at the Battle of Falkirk Muir. A battle marked by the monument and information board on the bottom right, close to Canada Wood Cafe to the southwest of Falkirk. Hawley's forces regrouped and returned to Linlithgow, where they were met by Provost Buckney, who had returned from his self-imposed exile. A contingent of redcoat troopers was stationed in the palace to keep watch, and they were still there on January 31st, a bitterly cold night, which required the soldiers lighting fires to keep warm. And on the morning of February 1st, the troops left without properly extinguishing their campfires. The result was that straw caught fire and quickly spread to the whole building, completely gutting the ancient edifice. Augustus Muir, in his book Travels in the Footsteps of Prince Charlie, wrote, "When he saw the smoke rising from the courtyard, Provost Buckney shrugged his shoulders and remarked that those who kindled the fire should put it out. And so ended as a royal residence the palace of the Stuarts, broken like their broken hopes." The Caledonian Mercury recorded, "Provost Buckney and the magistrates have examined several witnesses in order to get knowledge of the true cause of how the conflagration began. The keeper of the palace, Mrs. Glenn Gordon, was questioned, and she may then have related the tale, which is told to this day, that after unsuccessfully asking the departed troopers to help put out the blaze, she called out after them, ah, weel, I can run frae fire as fast as ony general in the king's army." She was no doubt alluding to General Cope's defeat at Prestonpans and General Hawley's retreat from Falkirk. The new government army commander, William, Duke of Cumberland, was more successful, defeating the Jacobite army once and for all at the Battle of Culloden, April 16th, 1746, the last battle fought on British soil. Over 1,300 Jacobites died in the space of an hour. The brutal hand-to-hand fighting captured top right in an episode of Outlander. Cumberland's relentless pursuit and merciless behaviour towards any remaining Jacobites earned him the title Butcher. And indeed, those Jacobites who were arrested faced horrendous treatment. Some were flogged, here depicted in an Outlander episode where Jacobite Jamie Fraser is whipped, the scene filmed within Blackness Castle. On his triumphant return from the battlefield, Cumberland was granted the freedom of the borough of Linlithgow, the certificate duly presented to him in a silver casket by Provost Buckney. Do I hear cries of hypocrisy? But by hedging his bets and kowtowing to the victor, the civic head had escaped any punishment, But his desertion of the town in its moment of need and his very obvious divided loyalties meant that he was not to remain long in office. He was replaced at the next election. So the provost may have hypocritically swallowed his Jacobite principles, but he had undoubtedly done the right thing for the borough. It was obvious what was happening to those who joined the rebellion. The brother of Jacobite clan chief Donald Cameron of Lochiel, the brother's name Dr. Archibald Cameron, was brought to Linlithgow in chains and incarcerated in the Tolbooth jail before being taken to London, drawn on a sledge to Tower Hill, and after hanging for 20 minutes, cut down, still alive, disemboweled and beheaded. The Earl of Kilmarnock was tried in London and, despite his wife's pleadings, found guilty of treason and duly decapitated. He escaped drawing and quartering by accepting the justice of his sentence and confirming that George II was the true and legitimate sovereign. Following his execution, he was buried in St. Peter ad Vincula, the church attached to the Tower of London, far from Linlithgow Palace, where he had often been in residence. He was also meticulous in settling his bills, including one for boots, which he had commissioned in Linlithgow for his troops, some 70 pairs in all, costing 3 shillings and 6pence per pair. Penalties were imposed, including one dictate which banned the carrying of weapons, another which outlawed the wearing of Highland garb. Tartan is not specifically mentioned, and neither is the playing of bagpipes or the speaking of Gaelic, yet another Jacobite myth. Under the 6th penal law, all Episcopalians were obliged to take an oath of allegiance to King George. These restrictions applied to all Highland clans, even those who had not supported the Jacobite cause, for example, those shown in green and pink on this map, and including the Rossies, the Mackenzies, the MacLeods, the Campbells, the Grants. Back in Linlithgow, the new provost, Thomas Dundas, had the unenviable task of dealing with the many compensation claims which came in from townsfolk. He was eventually successful in obtaining a grant of money from the revenues of the estates forfeited by the Jacobite landowners. This helped to settle some claims and also to make repairs to the damages caused in the borough, to the road and to the St. Michael's Well. It's amazing to think, isn't it, that well, 1720, actually witnessed many of the events that I've been describing tonight. The derelict palace no longer needed a keeper, and so Mrs. Glenn Gordon fades into relative obscurity. I could find only one reference to her in the court records of King George III. She is reported as attending an audience with the king in 1762. On being introduced, she told him that she had 4 beautiful daughters, who were each married and living in one of his 4 kingdoms. The king replied, "I have heard of 3 kingdoms, but never 4. Mrs. Gordon replied, "Did your majesty never hear of the kingdom of Fife?" Obviously, her feistiness had not left her. But what had gone was the end of any chance of the return of the Stuart monarchy. The young pretender, calling himself King Charles III, oh no, he's not. He lived in Rome for the rest of his life, where depression and alcoholism took its toll. He died on January 31st, 1788, not looking quite so bonny. And so ended the period of Jacobite unrest. There is still one Stuart claimant to the rightful throne of the United Kingdom. He is Franz Bonaventura Adalbert Maria Herzog von Bayern, Prince of Bavaria. That's him there on the right, but I doubt very few of us are going to flock to his colours, even if we do live in a Stuart stronghold, Linlithgow. Our beautiful but ruined palace, a testimony to our part in the whole affair. For years, the ancient edifice was neglected until it passed into the care of HM Commissioners for Woods and Forests, and then Her Majesty's Office of Works, who carried out major repair and consolidation in the 30s and 40s. Today, the palace is managed and maintained by Historic Environment Scotland, who in 2019 welcomed 104,000 people into the building. Isn't it lovely to see it here without scaffolding? For today, it is closed for health and safety reasons and is likely to remain so for some years to come. But that's another battle I have to fight. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, the Jacobite battles are over, and so is my presentation. Thank you so much.